Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The referendum result came as a shock to many, not least those in the campaign to remain. Lucy Thomas was Deputy Director of Britain Stronger In. In an exclusive for the Sunday Politics, she talks to fellow campaign insiders about how the referendum was lost.
We are absolutely clear now that there is no way that the Remain side can win.
It was a shock. Right up until the end, we thought that Remain could win. So how did we end up here?
I'm Lucy Thomas, and I was Deputy Director of that campaign and one of those that was there from the beginning. This is the story of what we did and why, but why in the end it wasn't enough. So let's go back to where it started. We launched Britain Stronger in Europe on a cold October morning last year in this former brewery. Cue the usual jokes about our organisation.
We set out to persuade people that Britain was stronger, safer and better off in Europe than we would be out on our own, and that leaving was a leap in the dark, a risk we couldn't afford to take. As a nation of Eurosceptics, we always knew it would be tough, but I'm not sure we were prepared for what the early research showed.
When we presented that and sat down and all discussed it with you and the team, I think everybody sort of gulped a bit and thought, God, this is going to be a bit harder than we thought.
Good morning.
So we built a campaign based on numbers. It's the economy, stupid, and it had been proven to work in the Scottish referendum and the general election. But were numbers enough this time?
I think one of the reasons why some of the specific warnings just sort of bounced off people was it sounded like scaremongering because it wasn't evidence. It was just saying if we vote to leave, it'll cost us this many jobs or this much growth or you'll be this much worse off. Well, why will I?
And people said they were crying out to hear from the experts. So from business leaders to economists, scientists to defence chiefs, they all spoke for themselves. And the weight of expert opinion was overwhelming.
The consequences would be negative if the UK was to leave the European Union.
Material slowdown in growth, notable increase in inflation. That's the MPC's judgment.
In a sense, we were the victims of our own success in the early parts of the campaign because we landed our economic message like an atomic weapon. We pushed the Leave campaign from Norway to Canada to Albania and then finally pushed them entirely off the single market. Of course, what it meant is that was the moment when they decided to adopt Nigel Farage's approach to this referendum and to make it all about immigration.
Imagine what will happen to public services when Albania, Macedonia...
When I first saw their PPB, the one with all the arrows implying that millions and millions of people from all sorts of countries, including Turkey and possibly some other countries that aren't in the EU, are going to come and move to Britain. When I showed that to focus groups, it was very powerful. Because it captured the anxiety and fear and emotion people have at the prospect of being overwhelmed and flooded and overrun. And these are all terms that I would hear in focus groups. And I knew that PPP and the literature that was used off the back of it was very powerful. I also knew, of course, that it was purposefully choosing xenophobia, indeed racism.
So we always knew that immigration was a problem. And it was in this room, around this table, that lots of the discussions were had. Some wondered, was there more we could do to get EU leaders to say something, to show more flexibility on free movement maybe? But to others, that meant fighting the rest of the campaign on immigration when we needed for it to be back on the economy.
If you could solve the problem of free movement, it would have been right to move on to immigration. If you can't solve the problem of free movement, moving on to immigration might just make things worse, not better. Of course, it's counterfactual, we don't know. But given what we did know, it made sense to stick to the economy.
But it became clear that for some people, that economic risk didn't mean anything.
I spoke to one man in my constituency who was out one day and he gave me his view of this. He was voting to leave because of all those concerns about immigration in his eyes. And when I said to him, I understand your concerns about that, what do you think about the argument that leaving would be bad for our economy? And he said, what do I care about the economy? I'm a single man with a dog.
There are lots of people in Britain who do feel passed over, forgotten, left behind. They don't see what the future could possibly hold for them or their children, and they're very angry. And this referendum was a chance to attach that anger to the EU. And we realised that really very early on.
Shouldn't Labour have been able to reach out to those voters?
The brutal truth of the matter is the leader of the Labour Party did not campaign with authenticity, passion, conviction or clarity from day one. He simply didn't.
He said he was for Remain, but it was on quite a narrow basis, and I think there was a lot missing in terms of what the broader argument could be. And you know, polling took place during the campaign that showed half our voters didn't even know that our official position was for Remain. So I think more could have been done, yes.
And whether it was true or not, the Leave campaign was determined to use just one number.
The power of their 350 million a week can't be overstated. I mean, in the focus groups, it's quite unusual for floating voters who aren't very interested in politics to have internalised a campaign fact or number that it comes out spontaneously, and it did. And when in focus group we would say, but have you also noticed there's been a debate about some people saying that isn't actually true? People say, well, vaguely, but you know, it's still a very big number, isn't it?
Good evening.
In the final debate, just days before the vote, the Leave campaign came armed with their catch-all phrase to solve any problem.
Taking back control of our country and our system.
Vote Leave and take back control. We can take back control over our laws. We can take back control over our taxes. We can take back control over our borders, immigration policy and security.
They were being presented with a very simple solution, which was, if you think this is a really serious problem, if you think the pressure of migration is causing these problems with our public services and jobs, we take back control. And what we had, I mean, the way I would put it is, you know, we had a complex truth up against a simple lie, and we see what happened.
And what happened will be talked about for decades. Though we'd built the biggest ever cross-party, cross-sector campaign with over 40,000 volunteers, we didn't win the day. This was a campaign where experts were dismissed and conventional wisdom thrown out of the window. Many doubt if campaigns will ever be the same again.
And Matthew Elliott from Vote Leave will be looking at how their campaign won the referendum on the daily politics. Well, Isabel, having looked at that and seen what they are now saying, I've now found myself surprised that Remain lost by only 4 percentage points.
Right. I mean, the bottom line is that their big argument on the economy, they went grossly over the top right at the beginning. They tried to create what pollsters call a settled view, which then becomes very difficult to dislodge. But in doing so, they went so far over the top that their claims became unbelievable, and simply adding more experts to it got no response whatsoever from the electorate. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, they simply had no answer on the immigration question. And I think that the majority of people who voted Leave, whether or not they would like to admit it, were in their heart of hearts voting so because of immigration. And Remain had no answer on that.
You didn't have to be a rocket scientist or even a psephologist to work out that immigration was going to be the big issue for the Leave people. We knew that. We've spoken on this programme months before the campaign began about that. And yet, even by the end of the campaign, they still had no answer to the immigration issue.
Yeah, and basically that's the legacy of years and years of British politics, where no one will make either a positive case, straightforwardly positive case for immigration, or a case for the trade-off that you make, a case for you say, we accept immigration because of the economic benefits. And I think their economic argument failed because people didn't feel that all these years of prosperity in the City of London had had any translation to the real economy. So when you said, well, it'd be terrible for the City of London, people thought, what's that got to do with me?
Yes, whatever.
Yeah.
To quote Mr. Blair in a different context. Was there anything Remain could have done to have won?
I think a different renegotiation in January, February by the Prime Minister, which secured some tangible concession on free movement, would have won it for them, actually. I agree with Isabel that the decisive margin were voters who were reasonable people but wanted some sense of control over immigration, didn't feel they were getting it, and therefore, in many ways, as interesting as that video was, it wasn't the internal dynamics of a campaign that was at fault. The reason they didn't have an answer is that Cameron didn't come back from Brussels and Berlin with something solid on free movement.
It was Angela Merkel what lost it.
Well, yes, and I'm sure that she's now bitterly regretting not giving Cameron something. But I think the other thing is that I know that when the Stronger In campaign had their very early meetings, before the campaign officially began, they had a discussion, can we identify 5 positive things about being in the EU that we can sell to voters? And they couldn't come up with any. And that was, again, part of the problem, that they did totally fail to put a positive case. It was just the Project Fear.
But I think it was also David Cameron what lost it, because for years to get elected in the Tory party, to get selected, you had to say you were Eurosceptic. Yes. He then had a career where he kept saying, actually, it won't be a big problem if we leave, to then pivot and say, actually, the sky will fall in.
It kind of, a lot of voters concluded, isn't that just typical of the political elite?
You're just making it up as you go along.
Exactly. And joining us, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Tim Farron. Welcome back on the programme.
Morning, Andrew.
Will the Liberal Democrats campaign to rejoin the EU come the next general election?
Well, we have to see what the lay of the land will be come the general election. Could be October, could be May 2020. And if it's either of those things, that obviously makes a difference. But just like every other Liberal leader since 1955, I believe, I will have in my manifesto a commitment that Britain is better off at the heart of Europe. There's a long way.
Member of the EU. I mean, suppose Chris Grayling said to us this morning, he thinks we'll be out by the next election. If it's 2020, look, if it's in October this year, all bets are off.
Indeed.
You'll have to take your position then. But if the Parliament goes its term and we're out of the EU, we're into the 2020 election, would you like your party to have a commitment to rejoin?
Well, I want it to be part of Europe, and I would like us, as things are, to be part of the European Union. Of course, if you'd asked me 12 months ago, I would not have predicted that we'd have left the EU. I wouldn't have predicted that Jeremy Corbyn would lead the Labour Party, or that David Cameron would have just resigned. So it's hard to predict.
You're not answering my question, though, are you?
Well, because in 4 years' time, the lie of the land could be very different.
Yeah, but I'm saying if we're out, would you... I'm just trying to work out, if you feel so strongly about it, will you accept the referendum result? Or will you try to get us back into the EU? So that's what I'm trying to get at.
I accept the referendum result. I think at the moment the trajectory is towards Brexit, and we have to accept that. I will have no time for MPs, and some do, who say that we should be undoing the result. That does not mean that I give up my campaign for Britain to be in the EU. I mean, as it's been said by others, you know, you have an election, and if you lose, you accept that with good grace, but you don't give up your principles and keep believing what you do. And so I hope that Britain will remain in the EU. I hope it will be the choice of the electors that that's the case. Politicians mustn't force that upon the majority.
You say you hope Britain will remain in the EU, but I may have missed this. Didn't we just vote to come out?
So the 52% were very clear what they voted against, and that was all they were asked to do. They were not asked to vote for one of the 5 or 6 different potential exit strategies or directions, whether it be full access to the single market, some level of free movement, or whether it's the almost North Korea option that a handful of people would prefer the United Kingdom to have. It seems to me right that the British people, before we leave the EU, are given the choice as to whether they want whatever it is our new Prime Minister comes back
So you want a referendum on the terms of departure now?
Well, let's be honest, nobody's voted for what comes next. People have voted to leave the EU, you must accept that. But it seems right to me that the British people, having made the choice 2 weeks ago, should also be allowed to choose what it is we get as the next step.
Well, that sounds like a referendum on the terms to me, otherwise it's meaningless, is it not?
Which I'm not massively in favour of, because I think what we've seen is that people are busy and they find it difficult to find the time for political campaigns. We have representative democracy for a reason, and there are some decisions I think that are better thrashed out and compromised between people who've been elected by voters to do that for them, rather than putting every single thing to a referendum. But I do think Tim's got a point to say that there is no problem with people campaigning for another referendum.
No.
1975 we had a referendum. It's not like all the anti-Europeans then went, well, turns out everyone really likes the EU. They campaigned continuously for the next 30 years.
Took them 40 years,
40
though, didn't
years.
it? So it's 40 years before he gets another referendum.
But it's not entirely
Even
impossible,
he might not. He's a young lad. Who's to say? You may, indeed.
Yep.
I mean, Gladstone was there forever.
I'll be about Gladstone's age by the time that comes along. My sense is that, I mean, I agree with you in one sense, that we don't want to be going to the public with a referendum on every single issue. The problem is that this government, in a chaotic way, has established that principle, which means that, frankly, it would be utterly wrong and anti-democratic for the MPs to then overturn in any way, shape or form what the electorate have just done. So that means that in terms of endorsing what happens next, and the 52% perhaps have 52 different ideas of what it was that exit looks like, and that's fine, they're entitled to that, but I think Britain needs to choose what happens next. It also needs,
hold on, let me bring
Article 50 is invoked, to choose whether they would prefer status quo.
So it is another referendum, all right. So you get, it's very European, keep having a referendum to get the result you want, you're signed.
Well, I think that there is a real danger that MPs will, over a course of time, basically dilute Brexit and not deliver it properly. And I thought that it was very interesting that people like Chris Grayling are actually arguing that Brexit is safer in the hands of Theresa May. Now, why is he arguing that when she was a Remainer? Because he says that she has the backing of the majority of Tory MPs. And of course, in Parliament, most MPs, a majority of MPs are for Remain. And he says that only Theresa May can actually push through Brexit, which is very counterintuitive, but makes sense when you think about it.
Surely no government could agree to a referendum on the terms, because Europe would then say, oh, so you need another vote. You're getting nothing then.
Yeah, it would be like Congress being given a referendum or announcing a referendum on a trade deal that they negotiate with another country. Why would the other country do a deal if it's subject to your own domestic politics? So I think a second referendum is unlikely. I do fear, however, that the entirety of this Parliament will be taken up by the process of extrication.
Could I just, what did you just say there about Article 50?
So look, if it is the case, and if the legal interpretation is that once one's invoked Article 50, then the matter is out of our hands, that's a little bit like jumping out of a plane without being sure whether you have a parachute. And so it seems to me the British people should be allowed to check the integrity and the safety of the parachute before we do just that. It means, do we know what we're going into? If we decide, if it is the collective will of the people, and it may not be, that we should be in the single market, for example, as many Brexiteers believe, then for us to press the button to leave the European Union without any guarantee that we'd have that access would seem to be foolish and against the national interest.
So are you saying that we need a referendum before we press Article 50?
Well, we'll have to see what the legal advice is, but I would not want us to be in a position where there was no turning back before we knew what we were getting ourselves into.
But the legal issue isn't about a referendum. The legal issue is whether you need to get a vote in Parliament to trigger Article 50.
To my mind, that is detail. What really I'm bothered about is whether or not the United Kingdom puts itself in a position where there's no turning back and it has to settle for whatever bad deal we might get out of the other 27.
But once it triggers Article 50, that's it. There's a 2-year timetable to do the deal.
And then you're out.
Yeah.
And the problem is, if you've done that, my understanding is that then there isn't an opportunity for us to effectively negotiate. We get what we're given, and it might be a really bad deal. And my job is now to make sure Britain gets a really good deal. The problem is that the discussions now might well all be about Brexit the next 2, 3, 4 years even. It's going to move on from being the stuff for the political classes as people experience the fact that, you know, they have less money to spend on holiday, the fact their savings are worth less, the fact their jobs are at risk.
Let's not refight the referendum
now. But it becomes bread and butter and people begin to realise the reality of it.
Let me ask you this, because there's some indication of in the Sunday Times this morning. Do you want to rebrand your party? Do you think that the term Liberal Democrats is tarnished? Do you want to change the name to the Democrats?
I don't. My sense is that, you know, our party has nearly doubled in size since the last election 13 months ago, and it's gone up by another 16,000 in the last fortnight. There's clearly a real movement of people, particularly younger people, joining the Liberal Democrats. You see the chaos in the other two parties, the need for a
So you're quite happy
strong...
with the Lib Dem
I am,
brand?
but let me put...
What about Labour Democrat? Does that sound good?
My sense is that if you look at the other parties and you look at where the Liberal Democrats are, we're in a position where we are now the marketplace, where progressives and moderates from other parties can safely gather. And so I want to say that we are absolutely open to talking to others in other parties. One of the good things I got out of the referendum, not the result, but everything else, was the fact that I shared, and many of us shared, platforms with people who we discovered we agree with a lot more than just on the European Union, and that would be good to take forward.
Have you got any Tories in your crosshairs?
I talk to lots of people. I'm not going to kiss
you
and tell.
always say that. Answer the question.
That wouldn't be very fair, would it?
I'm not asking for names. I'm just saying if you've got some.
I talk to lots of people. Politics is really...
to me, but I'm not
politics is really fluid. To say the least. You've noticed.
Do you buy this realignment? I mean, the Lib Dems They would, for it to happen at all, they would need both Andrea Leadsom to be the Tory leader and Jeremy Corbyn to stay as the Labour leader.
It requires a lot to happen. If it were to happen, if Leadsom did become Tory leader, Jeremy Corbyn was strengthened as Labour leader, then you've got actually not just a centrist party potentially, but a very big centrist party. What I would issue as a warning is that that new party would still be subject to all the squabbles that any existing party suffers. So, for example, were I to join and Tim were to join, there'd be a debate about what centrism means. Is it social democracy, or is it something more economically liberal? Does it mean complete commitment to the European Union, or does it mean honouring the referendum and getting out? It would be no less prone to the internal disagreements that you have in Labour and the Tories.
Did you buy this story this morning? There were 20 Tory MPs threatening to leave if Andrea Leadsom should become leader. That was just to frighten the horses, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't buy that at all. That sounded like 20 hissy fits to me. What I would say, though, in relation to a realignment is I think it's interesting what's going to happen to the UK Independence Party. Tim said that the Lib Dems were where the marketplace is, but think about all those people that voted for a variety of different reasons for Brexit and what happens to UKIP. I think we'll see that rebranding under a different name as some kind of People's Party, and that could be picking up a lot of Lib Dem and Labour votes.
Is Tim Farron right to be content, not content, but confident with the position the Lib Dems are in at the moment?
I think I was going to say last man standing, possibly token male leader
Yes, indeed.
after all
Yep.
this. So,
Yep.
you know, I
Happy
think
to help.
The joy for the Lib Dems is they have a very clear position and they're not gunning to be a majority party. As Janan says, they can have a focus and a unity that other parties don't have.
We shall see. Tim Farron, thanks for being with us. I'm
Thank
afraid
you.
we've run out of time.
I've been